hate when this pillow flips down. Well, hello there. I created this Rosa Notte Miku cosplay in just under 6 months. Let me show you how I made it. So let's get started on the bodice. So the first thing that I'm gonna make is what's called a chemise. This is just an oversized undershirt. It is usually constructed with cotton linen and has a longer length to it. Unfortunately, Miku's front skirt panel is fully exposed, so I can't make it historically accurate, so we can make it historically expired. Cotton linen is pretty expensive, so I opted for a rayon blend of it. This one has flowers on it. Ooh. I'm warning you right now, there are floral motifs everywhere on this costume. Now let's actually make this thing. This video that I watched was extremely helpful. When I was making mine, I did slightly alter the measurements to accommodate for the shorter length and the shorter sleeves of my chemise. So because I followed their instructions verbatim, I won't get too into the specifics of how I made it, but I will briefly go over the gist of it. Now the most important part of the chemise is that it needs to be strong. Historically, this is the only garment that was actually washed frequently, and it needs to be strong enough to withstand that. So we're going to flat fell every single seam. Here's how you do that. You're going to cut down the excess of one of your seams, then fold the excess twice and sew that down, and you're done. You should be better than me though, and actually press your seams before you sew them. It'll come out much nicer. Lastly, I went over all of the edges with my serger and covered them in bias tape. You could always do like a double fold hem or something like that too. Now that we're here, you're gonna see me sewing shirring channels into my chemise. Don't do this. I found out that these are pretty uncomfortable and I ended up taking them out. Next, we need to make the stay. Stays are actually older than corsets, and I differentiate them by the silhouette that they give. Historically, stays are usually made with coutil, which is like a very thick woven cotton, and they are lined with linen. Now, once again, these historical fabrics are pretty expensive, so I didn't buy them. I used a satin jacquard fabric, and guess what? It's got roses on it. Floral motif. Moving on, this video was extremely helpful for drafting the actual pattern for the stay. I'm mathematically challenged, so I struggled a bit, but with the tutorial, once it was done, I didn't really need to alter the pattern at all. So I highly recommend giving it a watch. This is how my pattern pieces turned out. Let's cut them out of our fabric, and I usually serge my corset pieces together. It fray checks them and flatlines them together at the same time, which is great for me because I can't be bothered. Next, you want to sew your pattern pieces like normal. I usually get pretty confused when sewing bodices with a lot of pieces like this. So what I do is I start from the middle and work my way out. I mean, like, sew both sides to the front panel and then move back on both sides. So I bought double fold bias tape to use for the boning channels. Next, I'm top stitching the bias tape over the seams. I use flat steel boning for this stay. It's salvaged from a cheap hoop skirt that I bought. I recommend sanding them and or covering them with tape. I did both this time around. Here I'm using like 200 or 300 grit sandpaper, and I usually use masking tape to cover boning, but I only had packing tape, so I guess that's what I'll be using. Just remember to cut your boning shorter than you need it to account for the seam allowance at both the top and the bottom. For mine, I kind of just fed them through and then felt where they needed to be and then cut them that way. But there's probably a more professional way to do that. Since mine is a stay and it has a pointed center front, I'm actually going to add additional boning channels, 3 at the front. All right, so in my opinion, this is actually the easier part of making stays. Now let's get into the hard part, which is tab binding. Unfortunately, all of the tight curves I'm actually finding pretty difficult to bind. Historically, leather is used for binding since it stretches, but I'm using double fold bias tape for the binding instead. What is working for me is sewing the curve of the tabs with my machine and then sewing the tight curves of the tab with hand sewing. Then you flip the binding in, and then I'm doing an invisible stitch, slip stitch. They might be the same thing now that I think about it. That's where you catch the inside of your binding, so not both sides, inside of your binding, and you catch where you want the fabric to lay on 1 or 2 layers of the corset. Then you pull them taut. It creates a very clean look because there are no visible stitches afterwards. Let's move on to the eyelets. Yes, eyelets. not grommets. Historically, eyelets for stays were hand embroidered. The video I watched on the subject recommended 2 pieces of embroidery floss, but I don't have any of that, so I just use 4 threads of just regular thread that you use for your machine. I also recommend that you wax your thread to keep it from knotting. So to create the holes, I measured them about 1 inch apart, and then I used my pointy scissors to cut them. There are tools that you can use and purchase to puncture the fabric, but mine broke, so I'm using scissors. This process of embroidering the eyelets took several days of on and off work. However, I do find embroidered eyelets to be extremely time consuming, but they are well worth the effort. I've added metal grommets to about 4 of my previous costumes, and I just like the look of embroidered ones better. They also don't snag on the ribbon when you go to pull it, and you don't risk them falling out like a lot of metal grommets do if you don't install them properly. Okay, so the last thing to do is to create the straps. I just eyeballed the pattern and created these pieces with the same fabric as the stay. We're also going to serge and bind the edges of these as well. Lastly, they also get embroidered eyelets to allow the ribbons to feed through them and attach to the stay. Okay, so the stay is done. I lied. There is an optional extra step that I did. So the last thing that I made were breast inserts. These just help with support. I just eyeballed the pattern once again, and I cut out 4 pieces out of broadcloth, 2 for each side. Next, I just stuffed them with cotton batting because that's what I had in my stash, and then I hand sewed them in place. Okay, now we're done. With the undergarments done, now we actually have to make the bodice. So for most of my projects, I use a duct tape pattern, and for this project in particular, I just salvaged the bodice pattern from my pomni to make a mock-up. From there, I'm cutting out the appropriate shape to match Miku's bodice, since there's a little bit of difference. So I'm adding more panels to the front to account for the pointed bodice, and I'm doing the square neckline. You could probably salvage a pretty decent dress pattern for Miku if you don't want to make the pattern yourself. For the sleeves, I eyeballed a lot of this, but let me explain the method to my madness. So there's 3 parts of her sleeve: the puff at the top, the fitted part at the middle, and her flared sleeve at the end. The puff was drafted using my arm length from the top of my shoulder to the armpit, and then I drafted just a generic sleeve pattern and extended it out. The fitted part of the sleeve is the measurements from my pit to elbow, the length and the circumference. And then the flared sleeve is the elbow to wrist, and then I made a mini circle skirt pattern to cut out my fabric. I just made a half circle skirt for these. I originally made them a circle skirt. They were looking pretty crazy, so I just literally cut them in half. And the mock-up looks pretty good, so let's actually make the final piece. Now Miku has a very specific damask pattern on the front of her bodice. In order to be accurate to the design, I decided to make this out of machine embroidery. Now before I get into this rabbit hole, I'll say a lot of people go a different route. I've seen people use traditional damask fabric for the bodice, and that's gonna be way easier than what I'm about to show you what I did. I've just never done embroidery before, and I really wanted to try it. Okay, so this is a very beginner tutorial to vectorizing embroidery and printing it out, so take this with like a huge grain of salt. So to vectorize Miku's bodice design, we need to save this pattern to our computer as a PNG file. Next, we need to convert this to an SVG file so that Inkscape can recognize it as a sewing pattern. I use Convertio for this, and it seemed to work well for my files. Now that we have our file, we're gonna open into Inkscape, because it's free. They also have a downloadable sewing attachment as well that helps you visualize the sewing path for your embroidery file. So here's what most of my problems started arising, was the sizing. So I have a Brother SE625, and the common standard for these embroidery sewing type machines is like a 4x4 inch hoop. So we'll need to split this up a lot more. My desired file is about 12 inches by 6 inches, which means I need to split this design up 8 times. I checked, and Inkscape doesn't really have a crop feature on their software. What I thought was easier was to crop all 8 files as PNGs and then import them into Inkscape that way. I really wish the machine would tell you like exactly what the size issue is, like your file is 10 by 3 and it only supports 5 by 3. Like, that would be really helpful. For my machine specifically, I exported it as a PEC file. I'm embroidering all of my files onto this polyester Dupioni fabric. I'm using cutaway stabilizer because it's just what I had at the moment. A lot fancier sewing machines will have like a proper function where it'll show like a projector that'll preview your file. But I have an older machine and it doesn't do that. Make sure you line up everything before you start your next file. After 6 days of work, she is finally done. Okay, this is my first pass. This is the second one I made. This is this. This whole thing is not in here. So I had to throw this one out too. So this one is the final one. Considering this is my first time making a machine embroidery piece, splitting it up 8 times, and all that other crap, I think it looks pretty decent. There's a couple things I'm gonna do to this before I call it done. For one, I'm gonna use some embellishments, and I am going to heat and bond this to the backing of this, make it as stiff as possible. Slight tangent. I got this machine secondhand, and when I got it, it came with a huge bag of sim thread, and I ended up using apple green for my project. Obviously I ran out at some point and I needed to go buy more, so I specifically went to their website and I purchased a new vial of their apple green, and they are 2 different colors. They look slightly similar, but when you hold them up to the light, they are definitely 2 different colors. Let's cut away the excess stabilizer, and like I was saying earlier, the sewing puckered a bit, so I'm heat and bonding this to a canvas layer to help with the structure. Since this is the front of the costume, I want it to sparkle. So I'm adding all of these Swarovski crystals, you know, those fancy crystals. I'm adding them to the front all over the bodice, and I'm using clear tacky glue to attach these. I don't actually think this is the best way to do this. I actually recommend E6000 if you're working outside, or Gemtac if you're working indoors, but I didn't feel like buying those, so I'm using tacky glue. My way of attaching them is having a dollop of glue on one side, and I actually get a little bit of the glue onto my tweezers. That way it can pick up the gem better. Then I saturate the bottom of the gem in glue, place it where I want on the piece, and then I use the other tweezers to keep the gem in place. This whole process took about 6 to 8 hours, working on it a little bit over time over a 3-day period. So once this is done, I'm gonna let this dry overnight. So let me tell you about the rest of the base bodice while we wait for that. I got this beautiful rose fabric from a cosplay yard sale, surprisingly enough. According to the seller, it is a stretch velvet wool flocking fabric. It is extremely thick and very heavyweight, and it is perfect for this costume. All I'm doing here is cutting out the fashion fabric layer now and sewing the pieces together like I did for the mock-up. But with that out of the way, I'm just gonna sew the embroidered piece to the rest of the bodice. Now for the lining, here you can see me cutting out broadcloth, which is good, but then you see I'm heat and bonding them together. I was planning on adding boating to the lining, but I don't actually think I needed this extra layer because this bodice is really warm thanks to the wool fashion layer, and the heat and bond, like, that just made it even worse. Anyway, I'm gonna assemble this pretty much the same, and I opted for synthetic plastic whalebone this time since I'm wearing a bone stay underneath. I don't need that much structure. Sanding the plastic boning is a lot easier this time, so I just sanded them and inserted them. All right, now the base of the bodice is done, so let's get to those lovely details. For starters, I wanted to bring out some of the detail in the center front bodice, so I'm doing like a simple back stitch of seed beads to the seam to the center, next to the center front. I opted for like this monochromatic colorway because it's black, so it complements the costume, but it has a slight tint of like purple and green and gold in it, so I think it adds a very subtle but tasteful pop to the costume. Next, we actually need to add the lace. I opted for crocheted lace, which in Lolita fashion is usually coined as torsion lace. This stuff is pretty hard to find for cheap in the US, so I bought it from Japan, Mercari Japan specifically. I opted for this really cute ladder lace for the neckline, and I was able to find a 9-centimeter length floral lace for the sleeves. Gray colored lace is pretty hard to come by, So I'm choosing to custom dye it with RIT dye. Annoyingly enough, this is where I figured out that torsion lace actually comes in 2 different materials. I just assumed all torsion lace was cotton based, but I guess not. With that being said, here is how I dye lace. So you're gonna start off with a pot that you do not plan on eating food out of ever again. Do not use food pots for dyeing. Have your one pot that you use for dye and then use everything else for food, but do not cook dye and food in the same pot. Anyway, I use a kettle to boil my water, and I personally think it makes the process of boiling the water faster. I also add salt into all of my dye baths to make the dye job go faster. I heard you can throw in some white vinegar to help it take to the dye better too. I also recommend wearing gloves while you do this because stuff gets everywhere and you never know if it's going to be touching you and it's hard to get out of your skin. I'm shaking this dye well, and then I'm eyeballing how much I want to add in. I recommend you go in increments because you can always add more as you go, but you can't take stuff out. And always test dye your jobs, and especially for synthetic fabrics, wet the fabric first before you add it in. It will change your life, I promise you. The synthetic problem child flower lace, I had to re-dye 4 times for my synthetic lace to become the same color as my teeny tiny lace. Another good tip that I can mention is when I first dyed my teeny lace and the teeny lace turned out too dark. RIT dye actually makes color remover, and it's really easy to use, and it can help remove the color out of your dye so you can start over. But I'm warning you, this stuff smells really bad, like really bad. But it is cheap, it's like $2 and it works great. So my problem child lace had another issue. It also would not stand on its own, and I'm thinking it's because it was polyester based. But anyway, we're gonna starch it so that it stands up on its own and it looks like the reference. You can use all kind of tools to starch your fabric, but I use the 1-to-1 ratio of water and Elmer's glue method for my lace. The more you wring your fabric, the less starch it'll be. So I didn't wring out my fabric at all for this step. Once it's fully dry, I'm gonna go through and iron all of the floral lace and the teeny tiny lace, because I want them to be nice and flat and pretty before I sew them on, and it makes your job easier too. Now that that's done, I'm just gonna sew this to the top. The teensy lace just gets sewn on flat, but I'm pleating my problem child floral lace as I go on the sleeve hem since it's a circle skirt. Learn from my mistakes. Miku actually has 3 additional layers of lace in her sleeve too, so keep that in mind. Why does she have that in there? Because she's extra. To make things easier and not have visible stitches, I'm just gonna hand sew all of this lace in and pleat as I go. Next, I'm gluing this velvet ribbon on top of all of the ladder lace. It's not accurate to the design, but I think it adds the perfect finishing touch. The Lolita fashion girl in me, I must have velvet ribbon on everything. Let's move on to the ruffles at the base of the dress. I'm using the same dupioni that's on the bodice for cohesion. Miku's ruffles gradually get longer in the back, so what I did for this is I measured the shortest and longest parts, marked it out, and then eyeballed the cuts in a gradual way. I only had 2 yards to work with, so there are a lot of seams in my ruffles, and to ensure they are nice and secure, since this is a competition build, I'm French seaming all of these before I go through and make all of the ruffle pleats. So Miku's design calls for box pleats, so let's make those now. Pretty much you just fold your pleats so that they meet at the middle like so. I usually use the fork method for my pleats, but because I have a very limited amount of fabric to work with, I am actually measuring how big I want the pleats to be. I don't know if taping measuring tape to your table is the easiest method, but it worked for me. I'm gonna pin all of these down now. I'd rather redo my pins than have to redo entire stitches. Once that looks good, I'm gonna sew those about 1 inch away from the hem. The last thing I added is this really pretty lace I purchased from Rakuten, Japan. I really struggle to find this lace in the US for a good price, so maybe try Rakuten if you have trouble finding it. We're almost done. Let's add the closures to the back. Here I'm folding over the excess of the fashion layer and hand stitching it to the corseted lining. Then I install 8 more embroidered eyelets, just like for the stay. And the last thing I'm doing for the bodice is the choker. I actually ran out of lace at this point, so I just sewed pieces together and pleated them to give the illusion that it's one continuous lace strip. Then from here, I'm sewing on some extra ladder lace to the top and then the ribbon. Lolita fashion chokers usually have like a ribbon closure to the back, so I'm adding one to mine as well. And the last thing I did is glued this cute little rose to the back to tack it on, and then I hand sewed it down to secure it. And now we are done with the bodice. We're not done with the costume. There is so much more to do. Let's tackle these skirts next. So there are 4 skirts that we have to make for this cosplay. A hoop skirt, a petticoat, a base skirt, and a bustle. So let's start with the petticoat because surprisingly enough, that's actually the easiest part of the skirts. So I followed Purely Cosplay's T-length petticoat video. All I did was cut out 4 tiers instead of the 3 tiers, and I cut them out of voile for this particular project. Voile frays really bad, so I'd argue that this step is pivotal to your quality of life later down the road. Now, I don't think the serged edge looks very clean, especially since I refuse to buy black thread for my threader because I don't want to thread my serger. So I'm going to bind all of these edges in that same bias tape once again. You can get an entire 50 yard to 100 yard roll of it for $12 on Amazon, and I highly recommend it. I'm adding pocket slits to make room for the pocket bags that we're going to be making later, and this petticoat also gets a drawstring waistband. And now we're done. Wow, that was so much faster than the actual time it took for me to make this damn thing. So next is the hoop skirt. There's a lace panel in the front of mine. I'm using tulle for this, but I don't actually recommend it because mine ripped. I would recommend something stronger like organza or voile maybe. Here's how my pattern pieces look. We have the circle, half circle skirt and the tulle front panel. So let's sew these together and install the boning channels using that same bias tape I've been using for this entire project. This gets a single fold bias tape waistband and a ribbon drawstring as well. So let's talk lace for a second. Once again, there are easier ways to make this hoop skirt. If you want to suffer like me, let me tell you how I made the lace panels. Well, hello there. We're in a slightly different corner of my room because my room is nasty. So I'm telling you right now, I'm embroidering the entire front hoop skirt pattern. But it was too big to embroider by my machine. I would have to split up each file at least 6 times, and there's 7. So I decided to ask for some help. This is the base of the hoop skirt. These panels, what I need to do to prep them, remove this from them, and then these, all 7 of them, are also going to get the rhinestone treatment. The bodice took me 6 hours, and there's 7 of these. I have a friend who has a Bernina sewing machine that has a much larger hoop capacity, and they embroidered it for me. You can always split up the designs or just use lace, so there's multitudes of different options you can do. I'm also reminding you that it is okay to ask for help when you need it. So here's the finished pieces when I got them back. They were embroidered on 2 layers of water-soluble stabilizer and tulle. So we need to submerge them in water to get the water-soluble stabilizer off. The stabilizer only really needs seconds to dissolve, but at the size of the lace panels that I need, I kind of needed to work the tulle through my hands and massage the stabilizer off. It turns into like a sticky paste and you can peel it off. They dried a little bit wrinkly since I didn't lie them completely flat, so I'm just going to iron them so that they're nice and crisp when I sew them to the hoop skirt. After I iron them, they also get the rhinestones added too. These are much smaller than the ones on the bodice. It only took about 2 hours per panel. I actually managed to knock out like 4 of these in one night. Don't do that. My eyes hurt after doing this. Give yourself breaks. Next, we need to sew this to the costume. For starters, I'm adding the boning channels first to flesh out the shape of the skirt. I bought a $20 hoop skirt off of Amazon and salvaged the steel boning for my project. I started off by hand sewing the lace on the floor and immediately realized this was a bad idea for my back. So I moved to my chair and this helped a little bit. You can see here I'm sewing some of the lace panels over the boning channels, but she only has 3 in the design. So I'm sewing the lace over every other channel. While I'm here, I'm also going to sew that ribbon on top of the panels to mimic the design of Miku's skirt. This whole process gives the illusion that my hoop skirt only has 3 bones in it, even though it has 8. And then it doesn't compromise the structure of the hoop skirt. The embroidered lace isn't as transparent as the reference material, but it does allow me to hide the boning channels behind it well enough, so I think it works out. Once that's done, we're going to sew a waistband and pocket slits in, and the hoop skirt is done. The next skirt to make is the bustle. I had just enough rose fabric to make the top and the bustle, thank God. Initially, I had cut a circle skirt and then drafted it on my dress form to get the curved shape that Miku has on her skirt. Next, I'm adding the same box pleated dupioni to the skirt, about an inch from the edge to account for lining this skirt later. The rose lace does get glued on and then I bag line it. This skirt gets a waistband and pocket slits as well. Now let's get into these adorable, but sadly not edible roses that I made. They're in my hair too. This tutorial was really helpful when making them. I altered the measurements slightly to make my roses bigger for my project. You're gonna cut out 5 to 7 pieces of ribbon. However many you add, it's going to make your rose fuller, so keep that in mind. Either glue or sew edges to the middle like so. Then fold in the edges and tack them down. These are gonna be your petals. Now attach them in a line like so, and then roll them up once the glue is dry. I use velvet ribbon for my roses, so a couple things I recommend is angling the petals to create a more rounded shape. And also space them out a little bit more than the video recommends, since velvet ribbon is thicker than the satin ribbon that they use. I also use hot glue to attach them temporarily, and then I use tacky glue to secure them down. There's 4 of the teeny roses that I need to make, and about 28, give or take, of the larger ones that we need to make. I'm making them assembly line style, where I make all of the petals first, and then assemble all of the roses. It makes things go much faster, at least in my mind. I will say the gluing method speeds up the process a lot, but honestly, I wish I just sewed these. I'm using a really cheap glue gun for this, and removing all of the strings later took forever. So next, I'm just gonna glue these onto the skirt. I have a reference offhand while I'm positioning everything, and then I glue them on. Next, I'm going through and sewing all of the flowers in place by hand. Once again, this would be easier if I had sewn the flowers together, because now I have to sew through hot glue and tacky glue. Yay. Cool thing is all of these stitches get covered by the lining, so they are nice and secure. With that part done, let's move on to the base skirt. Since the rose fabric is velvet based, I thought a velvet fabric would match really well with it. Everyone guessed it, I used velveteen on it. Yes, I used velveteen. Do I recommend using velveteen? Yes and no. I've made several costumes with velveteen before, and it's one of my favorite fabrics to work with, but it's not without its cons. For one, it is very finicky to work with. It slides around while you're sewing it, it's expensive, and it frays really bad, especially the cotton-based velveteen, but it's a very plush and soft fabric. The base skirt is a circle skirt, so I cut out the lining and the fashion fabrics at the same time. Next, I add seams to the sides to account for the pocket slits. These panels get serged first and then French seam to really make sure that they don't fray. Then I let this skirt hang for like a week. I straight up think I forgot it was back there for a second. Next, I'll cut through the middle to account for the open front. Now, let's install the lining. This should be a simple backline situation. And we're done. This actually feels like a weighted blanket. Very plush. Let's get into the accessories. Miku just has generic sheer black tights. You could probably just wear some regular tights, but I saw this really cute floral mesh fabric that I thought would be perfect for this costume. Now, if you have a big bum like me, I actually struggle making tights that fit me properly in both the hip and waist measurements. So the key to getting them to fit is just to take more measurements to account for your... And we're gonna sew these two fabrics together first. Once my mesh and velour are one acting piece, then we're going to sew the side seams, and then we're gonna sew one long stitch from foot to foot. I'm using a zigzag stitch to allow the tights to stretch when I'm wearing them, and then we're gonna add an elastic waistband, and then we're done. Let's talk about these goddamn gloves next. So I've made a couple of gloves in the past, but I've never made gusseted gloves. So let's try that, because we love suffering. I'm using these leather gloves, and I'm using them as a pattern for my velveteen gloves. If you're a beginner like me, let's not make gloves out of velveteen. Like I was saying earlier, velveteen frays really bad, but you don't have a lot of seams to, extra seam line to work with. so we can't serge the velveteen before making these gloves. Just use a stretch fabric or a pleather like everybody else. Don't be like me. Do better. So the little crosses on her gloves, I use the same embroidery thread that's on the bodice and the skirt, and I use like a really cute flower butterfly. It's a decorative stitch that I found on my machine, and I used some tearaway stabilizer when I was sewing it down to keep everything nice and neat. Now that our pattern pieces are prepped, I start off by sewing the thumb, because that's easier, right? Ah, it's puckering. Okay, so after that fiasco, I color coded the darts so I didn't get confused and want to throw these things in the trash. So that time was a lot better. Now I also numbered my gussets to the corresponding finger so I know which one is which. So let's go ahead and sew them now. I'm gonna sew pretty close to that edge with these stitches. Now that the gussets are sewn in, we just have to sew one long final stitch connecting the front and the back glove pieces. So to fray check the edges, I used a combination of watered down tacky glue and a blanket stitch around the entire edges of all of the gloves. kuMO from the future is telling you that that still didn't work out. So these gloves are still pretty fragile, and once again, I just recommend using a fabric that doesn't fray for your gloves. The next thing I'm going to do is sew the lace and the ribbon I learned from last time, and the gloves are done. See, we struggled a bit, but that wasn't that hard, right? Let's move on to the mask. So Rosa Notte and Rosa Bianca are Italian words, according to Google at least. They pretty much just translate to black rose and white rose. Miku's mask look pretty similar to Venetian mask. There's a specific way that they go about making them, and I wanted to use those methods when I was making my mask. So we're gonna make them out of plaster. This video was really helpful in the matter of making my mask out of plaster and then molding them to Worbla, so I highly recommend giving it a watch. So I started off with plaster strips, a box, scissors, and water. Start off by moving your hair out of the way. You really don't want this stuff in your hair. I used a wig cap for that. You're a cosplayer, I know you have one. Apply something to your face so that the plaster is easier to remove when it dries later on. Most people just use Vaseline, so you're gonna get that on your face. Once you have that on your face, you're gonna cut your strips out. We're gonna wet them with water and apply them to our face. Avoid your nostrils because you need to breathe. You need to let this sit on your face for about 20 to 30 minutes so you can spend this time terrorizing the people in your house by how crazy you look. So you're gonna remove the mask by like emoting, scrunch up, you can smile really wide, just like move your face around so that the plaster doesn't stick to your face. Once we have our mold, we're gonna cover up any holes that might be in there so that the plaster mixture doesn't pour out of our mold. Especially get the nose hole area, since you better have left that open so you could breathe. Now that that is dry, we're gonna mix our other plaster in the pail 1-to-1 with water and pour it into the mold. You need to let this dry at least 24 hours, not 2 hours like I waited. Mine ended up cracking because I tried pulling it out premature. I'm covering the entire thing in air dry clay. So now that we have a mold of our face, I actually think having a mold of your face is really interesting. Like, I've always wondered if I was a circle shaped face or an oval shaped face, and after getting a mold, it's pretty clear that I'm oval shaped. So learn more about yourself. Scare your family with your mold. The opportunities are limitless. So now that we have our mold, we can heat form the Worbla to the mold. This is going to fit perfectly, or at least it should, because we're molding it to our face model. Now what I don't recommend you do is mold Worbla to your actual face. Plaster is really cheap. You can even make masks just out of plaster strips. So it's cheaper than Worbla and it's less damaging to your skin than Worbla. Do not put thermoplastic on your face. While we're on the topic of Worbla, I will say I have used both a heat gun and a hairdryer to heat form Worbla. Everyone's gonna recommend you use a heat gun because it gives you a higher temperature than a hairdryer and it's less concentrated hair. Is less concentrated air. Now we can start cutting out the design. I have a reference in hand as I start sketching out the shape that I want for my mask, and then I cut it out. We're just worried about the eye holes and the general shape of the mask. Next, I'm gonna cover my whole mask in foam clay. This stuff is great. Foam clay will actually like fix itself. It levels itself, so it's really good for beginners. And then I'm gonna let that dry overnight. Once it's fully dry, Foam clay actually takes to pencil really well, so get that reference back out again and let's start drawing the tiny details of this mask. I find it easier to draw out the shapes versus the lines. It makes it easier for my brain to think of since the mask is a very complicated pattern. Cut out all of the details that we just drew out. Now that we're done, let's take this baby outside and get her ready for paint.
I don't know where my goggles are, but usually I wear goggles, but at least wear a mask.
So now this has been drying outside for about 2 to 5 hours. So let's go ahead and bring her inside and start painting. If you have cheap paints, I recommend buying like a tube of good quality black and white, either high quality acrylic paint or gesso. I have 6 different colors that I'm using. What we're gonna do first to make things easier is I'm just painting the windows of the mask first. We're not gonna worry much about how crazy it's looking, trust the process. Once that's fully dry, I'm gonna go over the entire mask with black. Since the windows sit lower than the surface of the mask, it's really easy to carve out the shapes without getting the black into the window portions that we just painted, if that makes sense. This took about 2 coats to get a nice clean finish. And now I'm just gonna use water and Duraclear in order to seal the mask. Now this mask is getting the same sparkly treatment. And lastly, I'm gonna add magnets to the side of the mask. You could leave it here, but in Miku's mask, there's like a shaded area where her eyes are supposed to be. So I'm hot gluing more of that floral mesh from the tights that we used to the eye holes. I actually cut out like specific flower portions of the tights. Flowers where my eyes should be. Now our mask is done. Picture this. You're backstage at your local con's costume contest. You're bored, or you need to know what time it is, or you need to call your mom, and boom, you don't have your phone. It's in the green room where you left your bag because there's nowhere to put it backstage. This has been my life competing for 3 years, no more. We're adding pockets to this Miku cosplay. So in the historical days, pockets were called pocket bags. They're undergarments that are attached to a waistband. This channel was really helpful in figuring out how to make these undergarments. I pretty much eyeballed a generic pattern for this pocket. I cut out 4 of these from scrap broadcloth that I had, and then we're going to flatline these together and then bind the edges in bias tape. Oops, I forgot to bind this pocket slits. So we're gonna bind those and then we're at where we need to be. Here, I'm adding some leftover floral lace from the pocket bags because they're cute. And then we're gonna bind top edges of the bag and we're done. Moving on to the bum pads, I actually ended up making hip pads off camera too, but they're made the same way. I cut out this pattern. Yes, I was too lazy to seam rip the boning channels in it. We're gonna sew these right side together and then flip them out, but don't sew the top edge. You should probably press this too, but my Walmart branded iron like genuinely scares me. So I try to use it as least amount of times as I possibly can. That thing like genuinely scares me. Then we are gonna sew 4 lines from the top to the bottom of the bum pad. Next, we gotta stuff our bum pad. I use leftover cotton batting and I also use leftover fabric scraps to fill these. See, hoarding fabric for 2 years can actually come in handy sometimes. I also think this is just a good way to repurpose fabric instead of throwing it away. Now, I did initially sew the bum pad and the hip pads and the pocket bags all to one waistband, and then I quickly realized I couldn't actually get to the pocket bags when I did that. So the pocket bags are actually whip stitched to the base skirt, like the heavy one, just to make it easier for me to access the pocket bags. And with that, we are done! I took the opportunity to try the costume on for the very first time. Today's the 10th, so I actually want to go ahead and try everything on. This is always the part that is the most daunting. I haven't tried on the entire costume yet, and there is the risk that I try it on and I hate it. It's happened before and I've sold costumes for that reason. It is the best costume I've made to date. Wish me luck. I feel like Miku for sure. I really like everything. It's just the skirt is like, it's really heavy. So I'm gonna have to stabilize it a little bit more before the competition, but I'm very overwhelmed, but it's a good overwhelmed. not the jaw-dropping experience I was expecting, but I'm really happy with this cosplay nonetheless. With this cosplay being finished, I actually need to prepare to go down to Florida to compete at the Winter Cosplay Championships. So let me actually show you some footage of how this big cosplay fits into my 2 check bags restraint. Let me cook now. So I can put that right there. And now we are just gonna zip this baby up. Now let's close Miku. The only thing I couldn't fit in there, this is the pocket bag and this is the bodice. Now that we're packed, let's go down to Florida for Holiday Matsuri 2024. Apologies, I am not a huge fan of vlogging, which is hilarious because I love watching vlogs. If you guys want more vlogs, I will film them, but I don't like making them. Anyway, Hallmat was actually at OCCC this year when they moved it. When I heard attached to the hotel, I thought it was something like at Dragon Con where it's like an indoor attachment, but it's not. You actually have to go outside the building and the whole thing is outside. My judging slot was really early in the afternoon. Luckily though, I got there and everything was great. The staff and the other cosplayers were so kind. And here is how everything went after I finished my judging slot. Welcome to Holiday Matsuri. I have Miku wig, Shadowheart wig, and as per Yaya Han's rules in her book, she says that you should unpack all of your cosplays. Prejudging went okay. I talked about everything I wanted to, but I forgot to discuss the artistic liberties that I took with the costume, so I'm a little mad about that. It looks like everybody was having a hard time finding where the new venue was this year, so I think I'm fine. The only thing I will say though is I had Miku on for about 5 hours and my waistline was hurting more than usual. I think it's the shirring on the chemise. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut that out and take it out, and then I'll get back to you on whether that solves the problem or not. So far, so good. Okay, I am back. This is the end of Saturday. I got into Miku this morning, but we were scouting the pool area at the Hyatt and we found like this chess area that was just perfect for Miku. And then I did my performance. I'm a little upset. My magnetic mask, it was supposed to connect at one point in the show and it didn't. I got some feedback from other people and they said they couldn't tell, which is good. But obviously it's frustrating to practice something for a month and then it not work. I'm a little scared that my performance was a little too weird and that no one's gonna get the message that I was going for, but I'm going to hope for the best. My costume has a lot of detail. I just don't think it's very clean because I'm a novice, but obviously I'm gonna be more realistic that, you know, probably Miku's probably not gonna place. And I'm okay with that. I'm just happy that I didn't trip and fall on stage. I was blown away by like everyone's costumes and skits this year. So Sunday was the walk-ons and the awards. And sadly, I didn't place this time around. But that's okay. I think social media kind of skews our perception of others. We only really talk about our successes because people are really mean, and why would you want to talk about your failures? But I wanted to bring this up because I too feel the pressure of cosplaying nowadays, where you see all of these perfect cosplays and we forget that it takes months, if not years, to make those, and the people making them have been in the cosplay community and making costumes for years. Everyone has failed at some point too. So I want this Miku build to remind you and me that we can all fail, but we can also achieve greatness. I shouldn't spend months working on a costume for anyone other than myself. So let's keep cosplaying for ourselves. If you got to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching. And if you are already making or thinking about making Rosa Bianca or Rosa Notte Miku, I truly, from the bottom of my heart, hoped that all the crap I went through helps you make your cosplay a little bit easier. Feel free to like and subscribe, because I'm sure you've noticed I didn't talk at all about this massive drill curl wig that I made for this damn cosplay, so stay tuned for that video. I also have my full WCC performance. Lastly, I am in the process of making a lot of new cosplays for 2025. I am pretty active on my current progress on my Instagram. I still want to make videos on how I've made some of my older cosplays, like Yuna or Sly Cooper, but I've lost all of the footage of making those cosplays, so they would pretty much just be sit down talky videos, and I don't really know if those are interesting to watch. And lastly, I hope you, yes you, have a wonderful day.